Good afternoon from here in London. My name's Brian Burridge. I'm the Chief Executive of the Royal Aeronautical Society. The outline of this afternoon's event is that we have three panelists and we'll hear from each of them for 10 or so minutes. And then we will go into a discussion mode and you are given instructions on the Q&A tote as to how to do that. Let me first introduce the panel, and starting with Katherine Bennett. Katherine is the Senior Vice President of Airbus, leading the company's external engagement and strategy in the UK, and she has specific responsibility for public affairs for all parts of the Airbus company, which employs 13,500 people in the UK. And now we have a pair of Pauls. We have Paul Richardson, who is the Supply Chain Vice President of Sales for Europe, Middle East and Africa for AAR Corporation. And in that respect, he holds sales responsibility for all of AAR's regional parts trading, that's particularly engines and airframes, their OEM aftermarket solutions, and their component repair, as well as overseas the sales activity throughout the region for which he's responsible. And lastly, Paul Briggs. Paul is a partner at Bird & Bird, Bird & Bird's International Aviation and Aerospace Group in London. And he offers clients over 30 years of experience in aviation and aerospace. And he covers almost every aspect of the sector. And Paul has worked previously in leasing companies and aerospace companies and advised airlines and service providers on legal requirements for and legal problems for various aircraft. So the briefing this afternoon is called Aerospace Post-COVID-19, because what we want to look at is rather more the longer term impact of COVID-19 on the aerospace sector. It's true to say that most players went through the initial crisis management part and are now beginning to turn their thoughts to their future strategy. So we would like to understand the barriers to recovery, how they might be overcome, and the sort of lessons that we can learn from the crisis to create a more resilient future. And from where I sit, the dramatic turn in aerospace and aviation is very real. In the first week of June, for example, across Europe, passenger volumes were 98% lower than the same period last year. And IATA, in their last report on the 18th of June, predicted that the combined loss of airlines in Europe would amount to £18.5 billion in 2020. And that puts at risk 6 to 7 million jobs. Happily, this week, Easyjet has started flying again. But in general, without passengers, the impact is felt through the entire ecosystem, from airlines through to airports and manufacturers and MRO, and all their supply chains right across the board, and the enabling businesses that wrap around it, such as lawyers, insurance, and finance. Now, China is showing signs of recovery, albeit in its domestic terms and rather more in terms of capacity available than passenger numbers. And some of the low-cost carriers more broadly are beginning to take to the air again. But the general consensus remains that we won't return to 2019 levels until 2023 or thereabouts, and long haul is deemed to be the last to recover. And of course, recovery depends on human behavior, which is notoriously difficult to predict. Overall, this is seen as the worst civil aerospace downturn since the 60s. So this afternoon's panel of experts in this field will give us a quick position report as to where their part of the ecosystem is now and how they see the future up to a decade ahead. And I'm going to start then with Paul Briggs to lead us off. Over to you, Paul.
Thanks, Brian. I'm going to, sorry, just go to the front of my, I'll interpret the questions really as how our clients are doing and what are we seeing, not so much how Bird & Bird is doing, of course. So I've worked in the sector for over 30 years, the legendary Guinness Peak Aviation, GPA, good years in Hong Kong and 10 years with British Aerospace and Airbus, over 16 years as joint head of the Aviation and Defence Sector Group at Bird & Bird. So we act for the entire ecosystem and have a broad perspective. You know, I work on any kind of commercial deal or restructuring for any kind of airplane or any kind of airline. So I think a good barometer of what's happening. I'm going to really look at airlines and investors. These are my personal views, not the views of the society, my firm, or any client. I won't focus just on the latest press releases or corridor or distancing announcements, but rather more the commercial, legal, and regulatory issues. So the first thing is, are airlines and investors about to recover? I got an email on Tuesday from Secret Escapes saying things are starting to look up, and so are our travel plans. There's a general sentiment of joy and relief that we've beaten it. For me, that is colored by the fact that some of my best friends in the industry have just lost their jobs. You mentioned job cuts, Easyjet 4,500, Virgin 3,000, Emirates 7,000. And Sir Brian, as you just said, people talk about how do we get back to 2019 levels? I see a lot of talk about, is it 3 years? Easyjet just referred deliveries for 24 airplanes for up to 5 years. A golden age, 2019, actually for many of my clients were struggling to survive through 2019. A number of them following the MAX crisis and also, I would say, the LEAP crisis. Airlines facing an AOG existential risk for reasons totally outside of their control. So I would also argue that actually the sector, certainly the aircraft leasing financing side of the sector, was ready for a downturn before COVID-19. At industry conferences for years, people have been talking about a funding gap. How were all of the airplanes going to be financed? Actually, what we had was a funding tsunami. I would say an oversupply of capital. Now, you can't blame Airbus for building airplanes that people will pay cash for, and you can't blame a second-tier airline for accepting a new technology airplane that it can get for long term on low rent. Actually, there's been something of a breakdown of normal supply and demand, leading to an erosion of normal protections such as maintenance reserves in aircraft leases. New aircraft have been supplied to second-tier carriers, damaging the secondary market. And rent has been based on over-optimistic assumptions of residual value and useful life. There's no doubt in January of this year that there was a general perception that we were at the top of the cycle. Of course, nobody just knew when that cycle would end. So new aircraft deliveries, I'm afraid no airlines or financiers want new aircraft deliveries at the moment, though I'm involved in 3 today and this week. What's going to happen next? I'm afraid airline failures. It will get worse before it gets better. And I wrote that yesterday before the news overnight about Qantas and Swissport. So I was quite involved in Monarch, Berlin, Jet India, and Thomas Cook. I've recently heard the expression, there'll be no winners, only survivors. Well, I don't think that's quite true. I think actually airlines and investors that can survive will come out stronger with less competition. So I would say what's happening in my part of the sector at the moment is people are looking to see who are the winners and who are the losers. There are a number of leasing financing journals, Ishka, Air Finance Journal, Airline Economics. Ishka do a table showing at-risk airlines, and it's a factor of how much risk is in the business model, particularly debt, against the degree of government and shareholder support. So I'm afraid that every passenger airline in the world is going to seek insolvency protection unless it either has minimal risk in its business plan or has material government or shareholder support. So Easyjet just announced a 4.9 million share issue. They are rated by Credit Suisse overnight to grow following the crisis. And that's partly because they're free to cut their staff and to negotiate against airports to get better fees. A number of airlines are getting state support now, but actually will be prevented from renegotiating their employment costs, such as Alitalia and Lufthansa. The big deal at the moment is Norwegian. Norwegian is now owned primarily by its lessor investors following a debt for equity swap. But it is failing, or it is struggling. not because of COVID-19, but because of the failure of its business plan, low-haul, long-cost model, and OEM failures. Like LOT, it operates Rolls-powered 787s and LEAP 1B powered MAX, facing existential risk of unscheduled AOG. And the current situation, I see it quite like MAX. The immediate reaction is compassion, a freeze, people concerned about the human impact. But then that's going to move to the legal impact. So my principal activity at the moment is restructurings and deferrals. And any loser, the community is going to repossess and redeploy the airplanes with an overall fear that investors have of getting trapped in a Chapter 11 type administration. And we're involved in some of the problems around Flybe at the moment. So looking at the future, some of the things that the industry needs to remedy the situation, firstly, regulatory change. I won't go into detail, but EASA and ICAO guidelines on social distancing. And guess what? I'm afraid Michael O'Leary is right. It is not possible to social distance on an airplane. Consumer protection, Regulation 261, can airlines give a voucher rather than a refund? Airlines are suffering at the moment quite enough without hemorrhaging cash for reasons outside of their control. Slot deferrals, the slot rules need to be continually deferred. The UK is implementing a new insolvency law to protect businesses, but that has to work also with investor rights under the Cape Town Convention. And ending Brexit and EASA uncertainty has to be in the interests of the industry. So airlines need support which does not increase their debts. And now we're going to have a period of massive aircraft redeployments. If 20% of the global fleet will never fly again, and 50% of the global fleet is leased, just think how many aircraft are going to get returned to investors. And of course, aircraft will now move from the losers who will go bust and have to reschedule their operation to the winners. Now, I'd like to think that a lot of that can be done with collaboration. I'm working with IATA at the moment on a statement to the global finance community. Repossessing and redeploying an airplane doesn't have to be a SWAT operation. For Jet India, I was involved in taking a number of airplanes out through collaboration. And please don't strand passengers, which would bring the whole industry into disrepute. So technology, I would see technology as being part of the solution. Two principal issues. Blockchain can be used all through the sector. My best example is back-to-birth trace of components. When I redeployed the A330-200s from Berlin to Virgin in 2018, the biggest single issue in the deal was the absence of back-to-birth trace for the components. Big data, this should be a great answer to the industry needs to reduce costs, to get to the goal of zero AOG. But there are trust issues. If you speak to Lufthansa, they do not trust Airbus, Skywise, or anyone else to manage the big data coming off their airplanes. So just to mention Sir Tim Clark, we are not in the business to deal with aircraft that don't function properly. The reason we buy new aircraft is to get 5 to 6 years of hassle-free operations on a technical basis. This is all before COVID-19 and has to be part of the answer. Some of the more powerful airlines that survive will look at a risk allocation with the manufacturer and the lessor community. So antitrust. Surviving businesses will come out with a bigger market share and less competitors. Potentially a greater control of data and the aftermarket. So rules on state aid and competition were never more needed. All of the OEMs are seeking to grow their capability delivery, Boeing services, Airbus services, to some extent following the model of total care. I salute the CFM IATA settlement agreement, but I wish to see who else will follow. I'd just like to finish with ESG, environmental, social, and corporate governance. These are the factors that will measure the sustainability and the impact on society. So before COVID-19, I really believed that this would be at the center of the growth in the industry, and I hope that will be the case. On the environmental side, green bonds have now been issued, but there are troubles with the green banking economy. The Economist this week, the trouble with green finance is one of their leaders. Sustainable aviation, as practically everybody on this call is part of Sustainable Aviation UK. I'll be careful what I say, but Sir Brian, when you introduced the Royal Aeronautical Society talk on this, you described this as two extremes. One extreme, the idea of net zero by 2050 with a 70% growth, and on the other extreme, the Guardian view, closing airports, which again can't be the answer. So governance, again, we want to live in a sector which can grow with stamping out and bribery and corruption, and also regulation. I'm afraid the statement "designed by clowns, supervised by monkeys" will hang over the industry for a long time, and the industry has to grow with a safety supervision that the public can be happy with. Just in conclusion, maybe other speakers will speak more about this. The Economist, 16th of May, its leader was "Goodbye Globalization." I think that sustainable globalization should be a good thing. And like Mark Twain, I believe that travel is fatal to prejudice, bigotry, and narrow-mindedness, which is why I've been so happy to work in the industry for over 30 years.
Thank you, Paul. A rich hunting ground for questions there, I feel sure. Do keep the questions coming in, please. And now let's look at the perspective from an OEM. So over to you, Katherine.
Thank you, Brian, and thank you to the Society for the invitation. So I heard a good quote once: "What are the drivers for change?" And the answer was passion and pain. Now, I'd rather that we were dealing with passion in terms of the passion that Paul just used when he said how much he enjoyed working in the industry for the last several years. But sadly, of course, COVID-19 has given our industry more of the pain. So let's hope that this pain does cause a lot of innovation and some of the issues that Paul outlined. But of course, as you've both said, we are facing the most serious crisis of our generation for our industry. Our CEO, Guillaume Fauré, has talked about this as being the gravest thing he's ever dealt with. And it is quite shocking when we talk to you here today that it's now been 3 months since the World Health Organization declared COVID-19 as a global pandemic. 3 months. Various statistics have already been said. IATA estimate that worldwide domestic flights alone are down by 70%. Airports in the UK have seen 90% fewer flights, 90% fewer flights, and revenue has already been said amongst our airline customers about 50%, maybe more. We are hopeful, of course, as an OEM that we see that domestic air travel will increase. I'm talking to you today down in the West Country. I live near Bristol, and we've heard that Bristol Airport had its first flight to Portugal booked out within 5 minutes. So people are keen to fly again, certainly more short-haul flights. Wide bodies, as has already been said, we estimate that market will not be anywhere near it was, at least for another 3 years. We see now the single-aisle generation aircraft are being used more and more. Easyjet started their flights, etc. And I just heard a story from a friend the other day that they booked a last-minute flight to Portugal. They booked it at something like midnight, and then they got on the flight at 7 o'clock the next morning. So that last-minute bookings are good if anybody fancies a trip to Portugal. So if I may touch now on Airbus, 13,500 employees in the UK. We are the largest space company in the UK. We're a world leader in cyber. And we're the largest supplier of large aircraft to the RAF. And we also provide 50% of the UK civil helicopter fleet. So we're not just an aircraft manufacturing company, we are also in many other parts of aerospace and defence. And thank you to the Society for all the work you do in championing all those parts of the sector we're in. So what has COVID meant for Airbus? I mean, obviously we've seen the impact on UK airlines. Airbus aircraft are in 54% of UK fleet at the moment, and actually 70% of UK airlines backlog. And as Paul said, a lot of those orders are moving to the right. And of course, an OEM like us, we're further down the chain than airlines and airports who've been very much at the front line. But of course, the impact on us is hitting hard. So back in April this year, we announced a reduction of the production line of our single-aisle aircraft. We were building 54 aircraft a month, and that's now down to 40 on our 350 wide-body aircraft. We were building 9.7 aircraft a month, and we're now down to rate 6. And that reduction obviously then had its impact on our supply chain and of course our important employees. So very, very challenging times for us. As we're talking today, we are still in lockdown, so we're still in slight survival mode, and we're pleased to see that the country is opening up again. But just a quick summary for you in terms of running our business, the operational side of Airbus. We had to, of course, look at all the safety measures for our factories. Aircraft wing manufacturing, there is a certain amount of distance. It's not like working maybe on a car production line, but we really had to bring in a lot of different measures, and our production lines did remain open for a long time. Some amazing operational changes came in, and it was talk about collaboration, as Paul did earlier. It was amazing to see how our trade unions and employees work together. And if I may, as I speak to you today, give a bit of a shout out for the work that we did along with other aerospace companies, BAE Systems, Rolls-Royce, Meggitt, GKN, on the ventilator challenge product. So I said to somebody a few weeks ago, we're all in the healthcare business now. The collaboration amongst our engineers in those different companies, I mean, I found myself working alongside people from Ford, from McLaren, from many, many other companies, and just end of this week, the production line at Airbus that was producing the Penlon ventilator will finish. So we had an order of 15,000 units from the government. Quite incredible, the work that went on there. And I think the aerospace and defence sector and engineering, in terms of the work done together, should really be highlighted. Of course, other parts of the business had less impact in terms of COVID-19. So our defence and space business continued to, in fact, ramped up a lot of their work. The A400Ms that we provide to the RAF, they were used a lot for some of the medical emergencies, and our helicopter fleet, of course, providing support for the blue light and many other aspects. Customers, airline customers, as Paul said, clearly a huge issue, and we're working closely with our customers on how we manage the orders that they've made. Many of the deliveries, of course, will be deferred. Some of the Chinese airlines are now back talking to us and taking deliveries, and we hope that's a pattern, of course, that will continue. Some of you know my background. I mainly face dealing with the government, so there's been a lot of debate about the support given by the French governments, the German governments, the US government to aviation and aerospace, and Brian, I'm sure will talk about that a bit more, but there's been various aspects of support that we've had to ask for and needed. And maybe if I could just finish on talking about the safe return to flight. We've endeavoured to work alongside airports and airlines in, restoring trust in flying again. Of course, we know that people have concerns about getting on the aircraft, but we've endeavoured to talk about the technology in our aircraft. For example, the filtration of air is changed every 3 minutes. 99.9% of all particles are changed. There's going to be a lot of issues to do with logistics about people going on board and wearing face masks, etc. But we've really endeavoured to work together with airports and the rest of aviation on encouraging people to return to flight. And perhaps, just a call out to Royal AeroSoc supporters and members, we do need our aviation industry. Remember the importance of contribution to trade, tourism, and just interconnectedness in many ways, signing deals, etc. I know a lot can be done virtually, but there's so much more that can, the UK can contribute to the future of world trade. Thank you, Brian.
Thank you very much, Katherine. And now to Paul Richardson and the AAR, and it's certainly one of my observations that the aftermarket in all of this is very often A, misunderstood and B, neglected. And Paul Briggs brought out the importance of the aftermarket to a certain extent, but now Paul Richardson, for your insights, please.
Sure. Good afternoon, everyone, and thank you, Brian, and thank you to the Society for this invitation to speak. I've been fortunate enough to have been with AAR since 2001 in various guises, mostly in the sales sector. I fortunate to have spent 9 years in Asia as well. So during that time, I've seen 9/11 from pretty much a month into my tenure, and then thereafter we've had SARS and 2008 financial crisis. But this is certainly unprecedented, and has got us all in a tangle, so to speak, in that respect. So as you can appreciate, our AAR's response to this crisis has been ever changing. And so we continue to adapt to what is needed from our worldwide customer base. We have a quirky fiscal year. It runs from June 1st through May 31st, so we just started in our new fiscal year. And pre-COVID, the Corp was on track to actually achieve one of its best years ever, so entered essentially the outbreak in a position of financial and strategic strength. Fortunately, we have diversified business groups within AAR. We have a mix. Approximately 35% of our sales is government, and the balance on the commercial side of things. But equally, what we've seen, sir, is that the government side of things, similar to what Katherine mentioned there, has been relatively strong throughout this period. As we have seen a lot of our touch points from a customer perspective, the commercial side being cargo. So that's kind of helped us throughout this period of time. But of course, we expected and saw a sizable impact to our business serving the commercial airline market as a result of the decrease in commercial air traffic. You know, it's a complicated scenario. We continue to align our cost structure to the reduced demand in the market, and like many other businesses, have found ourselves in a position of needing to make some very, very difficult decisions. We've certainly downsized in that respect from a personnel perspective. You know, we obviously have a lot of personnel in the States with regards to the aircraft maintenance side of things. We've looked at site rationalization, and we ultimately need to streamline and ensure that we have a platform in which to build going forward. And it's almost a Churchill comment, where ultimately it comes from our CEO at the time, is never let a good crisis go to waste. So while that sort of tends to be a bit of a horrible phrase to sort of mention, we do have to keep in mind that we have to overturn opportunities that reasonably, you know, in the past we potentially may have overlooked in that respect. So these are certain areas, you know, some obviously the focus on the cargo side of things has certainly proven beneficial in that respect. So in terms of, you know, some of the barriers, the immediate barriers to the recovery, you know, my responsibility lies with the parts trading side of things, so I'll ensure that I focus on that more than anything else, because I think I'll be a cause for insomnia if I cover the rest of the AR business units. But ultimately, when we talk about, I guess, the recovery side of things, it's firstly important, and it's something you mentioned, Brian, a little bit earlier, that in the 2008 financial crisis took 6 to 7 quarters to recover. And we're actually envisaging right now that this is going to potentially take 12 to 15 quarters for us to get back to pre-COVID levels. So obviously that requires monumental changes. And in terms of, you know, immediate barriers, with the airline network not expected to be back up and running at 100% capacity for a very long time, demand for our airframe components especially is down. So what we're seeing is the inflated inventory levels and the ability to defer maintenance will be the headwinds to the immediate aftermarket recovery. Equally, and I cover the engines as well, I've got a fairly wide gambit in that respect. We are seeing a substantial level of engines with green time availability. Again, it goes back to that engine deferral perspective. So that that will really impact in terms of the aftermarket side of things. So we kind of anticipate this whole scenario being relatively light, continue to be relatively light from a commercial perspective throughout this first quarter, which is ours, June through August, and then ultimately bottoming out coming to the end of our second quarter, end of the year, essentially, in that respect. I can add as well the uncertainties, because the used surplus market, you know, a lot of it is driven by starts with the acquisition of assets and major assets. And right now, when we talk about the availability of aircraft, there are quite a lot. So traditionally, if we look at like a previous 5-year trend, annually there's about 5 to 550 teardowns, aircraft retirements per annum. And I'm sure Paul may correct me if I'm wrong from a statistics perspective, but we anticipate about 2,500 aircraft to be retired this year. Typically, you see a sizable swathe of those go for teardown, but we're not anticipating seeing those teardowns come through for probably another 1 to 2 years. And the reason for that is just the question mark with respect to the or the uncertainty with respect to the aircraft values. And so people are not necessarily going to take a risk. I know that back in 2008 financial crisis, we ourselves got caught unawares after acquiring certain assets, and quite a lot of them, and within I guess a few weeks we suddenly discovered they were overcosted. So it's key for us to obviously keep an eye on the ball in that respect. So, you know, when we talk about trying to overcome some of these situations on the used surplus side, we will look to focus in the short term and for obviously during this entire period on the assets that basically we know that will retain their values. That's a key area from an airframe maintenance, aircraft, both maintenance and also airframe maintenance side of things, and also from a part supply perspective. So we're strong on the engine side, and this is, as I mentioned before, it's been very proven beneficial over the last few months, especially in support of some of those engines that applicable to the cargo fleet. And that's some of the legacy engines, such as your Pratt 2s, your RB211s, CF6-80s, Pratt 4, some of the large fan. But when we talk about some of the CFM 56-7B, 5B, and V2500, which are on the PAX aircraft, then that's where we've seen shop visits absolutely plummet. So focus is going to continue on those wide body aircraft plus those cargo applicable engines in that respect. Our distribution business, which focuses on new parts supply, like they align themselves with the OEMs in that respect, they continue to partner. We anticipate signing a couple more agreements during the next couple of months, and that's ultimately ensuring that we have some degree of platform and posturing moving forward in terms of capitalizing from a market demand perspective as and when we get some lift off. So, you know, we've been around for a very, very long time, AAR. One of few true aftermarket companies that have actually managed to navigate the cycles. And so, while you know, we have a lot of experience in that respect, and we're not, I guess, shy to take preservation action, and we will. And that's in terms of overcoming right now. We will continue to make obviously difficult decisions and streamline accordingly. So the key for us moving forward would be to, you know, keep the eye on the ball, retain our relationships, which is very key in that respect. Capitalize on behavioral changes, and when I mean behavioral changes, there are certain areas of the market, I guess the customer base, and we talk about China, that's been mentioned in terms of the uplift there, whereby new only has been more applicable. And those mindsets and those behavioral patterns are starting to change as obviously people look to reduce their expenditures as we go forward. So these are indeed certain areas in terms of how we're looking to sort of move from a short-term perspective and balance the books. You know, we could talk about how do we see things in a decade's time. Paul mentioned it, and I made a note of that. It's a key point. We were kind of during every single conference that I've been to in recent times, everyone was talking about that pending cycle, that decade. So when we talk about where we want to be in a decade's time, it's almost sends shivers down my spine, because we don't necessarily want to be talking about the same downturn in a decade's time. But there will be a degree when we talk about what we look at, how we see ourselves in 10 years' time, for example, that first and foremost, we need to look at this shift. The 10-year expectations in terms of obviously some of the aircraft retirements and these teardowns and etc. will have a knock-on effect. So what we had in terms of expectations for pre-COVID of a 10-year cycle is now shifted probably 2 or 3 years in that respect. As Paul also mentioned, in terms of the aircraft positioning right now, not many airlines are looking to bring the new aircraft in, and so there could, during that period of time, be an extension from current platforms in which we may be in a position to benefit in terms of the part supply in the aftermarket. That may well stretch a little bit longer now, and while obviously oil prices are down. So it's again continue to ensure that we navigate that cycle and posture accordingly. But you know, ultimately, and this has been touched on before, we need to make sure that, and it's been in the news as well the last couple of days, we need to ensure that we don't see another wave, a second wave of this pandemic, because that that would ultimately determine the landscape for this industry altogether. People are obviously on the brink of the precipice, and God forbid that we actually see this go any deeper in that respect. But ultimately, from a second, we talk about the first, we don't want to see a second pandemic, because while we do have a government flavour, etc., there is a strong element from a commercial perspective which could potentially be ultimately destroyed in that respect. But secondly, the depth of the economic crisis that is looming, and we hear about it and we can see it, but we can't actually necessarily appreciate what's going to happen in the next few months. And will that be unprecedented? Will there be a rebound strong enough to fight through it? It remains to be seen. And these are the big concerns that we have at the moment in time, because from a travel industry, while people for the next decade will still want to have that adventurism and get on planes, and there's no substitute for flight. If it's not affordable, then of course that's going to have a detrimental impact in that respect. So that's kind of the whys and wherefores in terms of where we are from an AAR perspective, and so how we see it going forward.
Well, thanks very much to all three of you. Three very insightful injects there. We got a number of themes developing in our questions. State aid is of interest, sustainability and the R&D investment that might go into that, and of course the matter of human sentiment and how we stimulate that, something that Katherine touched on. But I want to start with the low-cost carriers, because the way it's beginning to look is that the pent-up demand such that exists, and this is to a certain extent proven in China, it's about domestic stroke regional, it's about visiting friends and relations, it's about leisure. And we are probably in the business of setting business travel to one side, although personally, I don't think Zoom or whatever will ever substitute for the looking someone in the eye across the table when you're cutting a deal. But for the low-cost carriers, then, they have a certain advantage in that most of them are point-to-point, they're not feeding hubs. And so the recovery, at least recovery planning, looks straightforward. They probably have less requirement to get involved in capital markets in quite the same way as some of the big players. But how do you see that emerging, and how do you see their business models potentially changing over the coming 5 to 10 years? And we'll start with Paul, if I might. It'll give us a kickoff on that.
Okay. I think the basic principles that I spoke about earlier will apply. So a low-cost carrier will thrive if it has had a business model where it can just cope with the amount of financing cost it has, and if it has sufficient support either from shareholders or from the government. So Easyjet had previously had a government guaranteed debt to raise cash, and has just raised money from its shareholders. So a business like that is ready to firstly survive, because the first thing you've got to do is just survive. So short-term cash is king. Do other people believe you're going to survive, and so give you the cash to survive? And then actually, when so many of your competitors fail, to be in a strong position to grow. So the business model, I think, is about containing costs. Initially containing costs sufficiently just to survive, but then to remain true to the low-cost model, to grow when this is done. And I think that they will grow, and I think that will also be using some of the other themes I've discussed about digitalization, about moving to a kind of sort of holistic travel model, so that actually bringing in-house some of the travel capability. And I think a number of other low-cost carriers will essentially seek to replicate the different models of either of Easyjet or Ryanair. And I think it's a pretty tough time to be an airline in Europe, particularly the market that I know more about, without a very supportive shareholder if you have large capital requirements. And obviously it's great to have selected a winning airplane.
Yeah, and I'm going to go to Katherine now, because there was common ground between Boeing and Airbus in their last investor presentations at the back end of 2019 on the predictions of the number of new aircraft out to 2038. And both came up with a figure very, very close to 40,000 and a few. Clearly that's changed, but just sticking with the low-cost carriers, Katherine, how does it look from Airbus's point of view?
Well, clearly, Easyjet, if we're talking about them, were an absolutely vital customer for us, and very innovative in terms of the way they like to work with us. Paul mentioned Skywise earlier, and Easyjet were one of the first customers that we worked with on that. The use of data and the performance of the aircraft, absolutely a key thing they focused on. Yeah, I mean, they obviously short haul, so they're part of what we analyse as being the part of the market that will get back again quickly. But I could imagine that it's been pretty tough for them in terms of having to manage their staffing issues, their relationships with the airports. There's been a lot of short-term pain, and it will take a long time. Our evaluation is it will take a long time for that market to steady again. But I see the low cost as being perhaps at the vanguard of the recovery.
Yeah, thank you. And Paul Richardson, and I'll kind of elongate the question for you, a bit of a cheeky subsidiary question perhaps, but in terms of the recovery of that sort, how will that affect you? But more particularly, when you look at someone like Swissport downsizing, are you tempted as someone who's in the MRO business? It's not a hugely imaginative leap to sort of extend the envelope and think about handling services and, in a sense, the entire value chain in supporting an airline to do its business or an airport to do its business.
In terms of answering that, obviously the last question, it's interesting because we had received a few inquiries because, of course, with our experience from an MRO perspective in the US. You know, can we extend that supply chain down to sort of almost a ground handling perspective? The answer to that was no. While we're okay to look at exploring opportunities, that's not one that AAR will obviously look to grab at this moment in time. With regards to the low cost side of things, it is an area of focus from an AAR perspective because of the fact that obviously the fleets are pretty large in that respect, and there's a potential to capitalize. We see that they will have a potential to capitalize on the market share as we come out of this, assuming we do come out of this. But we do have to take into consideration that in terms of a rebound, that can be regionalized to some degree. Having worked in Asia, you know that China, for example, is reliant on in terms of the immigration. I mean, it's swathes of people that are going to the big cities to work in that respect. The psyche there is completely different to the rest of the world in that respect. So you do see the necessity for flight in that respect. While trains, etc., have been and the network's been developed quite quickly, they don't have the capacity to be able to take everyone. So flight is essential in that respect, and that's where we're seeing a lot of the rebound, early rebound right now. Whereas it's a little bit of a different philosophy from a low-cost perspective within Europe, for example, and elsewhere. It's typically tagged with leisure in that respect. So that is I guess the concern from our perspective in terms of, you know, do you capitalize and capture the business traveler in that respect, or will it continue to be the traveling market, the traveling masses that utilize these low cost carriers, and therefore from an economic perspective, will they be jumping on the aircraft, confident enough to get on the aircraft moving forward? Katherine actually mentioned obviously the cleanliness of air in the cabins, and we distribute for one of the ozone and VOC converter companies. And what is interesting, I guess, is the amount of the air that gets bled from outside on a regular basis. It makes that cabin a much more cleaner than your typical office. So while we're all sitting working from home, the air in here is probably less clean than that you'll find in an aircraft. And trying to be in a position to get OEMs to relay that out to the marketplace to instill that confidence, I think is going to be a critical thing in terms of helping us rebound in this industry. So
Yeah, thank you. I'm going to move on to state aid. I'm going to come to Katherine first, but it's been something of a voyage of discovery, and of course, state aid has a tail to it, TALE, and there is, and also a TAIL as I think about it, but there is, there are not necessarily all upsides with state aid, and a good example, Lufthansa, most successful airline in Europe for the previous 3 years, finds itself in a bind because German government wants to apply particular conditionality, and a significant shareholder doesn't, regards it as potentially limiting to the freedom of action of the board. In other cases, Michael O'Leary is very clear that it distorts competition, and particularly in Europe, where we've got Alitalia, Lufthansa potentially, Air France heavily subsidized during a summer period, and Ryanair working on the basis of market forces. So, and for OEMs as well, of course, because this doesn't come as a free good. So what's your take on the limitations of state aid when you're developing your strategy downstream 4 or 5 years' time? You know, what do you have to take into account?
I mean, obviously, there's lots of different dynamics in those examples you've given there, Brian, aren't there? I mean, some of those airlines and, of course, parts of Airbus are state-owned. They've got small shareholdings, so there's a very different dynamic there. And you know, I've read the discussions about Lufthansa with interest. Obviously, the market here very different in terms of airlines, and I do have to often spend quite a lot of my time explaining that to colleagues, that it's very, very different here. Obviously, we're still bound by state aid rules at the moment as a country, and the government have made that pretty clear to all parts of industry. And I think what's been interesting here in terms of the support given to industry, the furlough scheme, the job retention scheme, the government have been very clear that that's for, you know, across the whole business, the whole sector. And they've been very clear to us that they don't wish to do sector-specific schemes here in this country. And you're right, Brian, there are some stings in the tail for some of the packages already in terms of, you know, what's the detail in terms of what other European countries have given. Of course, there's elections in France too, so there's always a political dynamic, isn't there, to most things. But I think let's just cards on the table. The government have been supported through the Bank of England COVID Corporate Finance Fund, and that's on the public domain on the Bank of England website, that aviation and aerospace companies have accessed that fund, I think to the tune at the moment of around £3 billion. So, but that's obviously in the form of a loan. The other important thing that the UK, French and German government does is the support for export credit. Now, whether airlines are going to be buying aircraft that quickly is another matter, but the support behind that is of course very important. And you know, for me, I like to encourage our government here in the UK to continue to work closely with the other export credit agencies across Europe. And in fact, I'm proud the UK government are seen as one of the best on that score. The US obviously had a huge package announced as well. Part of that was potentially for an aircraft scrappage scheme, another issue being discussed in Germany. Where would that go potentially? I used to work in the car industry and obviously have seen how the car scrappage scheme worked over here, and I understand they might be looking at doing that again, but that's an interesting dynamic. Some public policy ideas are being promoted about an aircraft scrappage scheme. We understand that about 7% of UK aircraft are more than 15 years old, so there's maybe a potential there. And obviously, I would say that, wouldn't I? It would be good if newer, cleaner aircraft, Airbus aircraft were bought as a result of that, but clearly it would have to be balanced between Airbus and Boeing. So yes, but state aid takes lots of forms, state support takes lots of forms, and it's always going to be thus. I mean, every single nation wants to have a part in aerospace and defence, so why shouldn't they invest in it?
I'd like to go to Paul Richardson now. And Paul, if you would just give us a flavour of what's going on in the US and how the US side of your business react to that, how they feel about it. And when I come to you, Paul Briggs, if you would just give us your breadth of European understanding, that would be really good. So Paul Richardson, over to you.
So from a US perspective, there's obviously similarly been some strong state aid opportunities. It hasn't necessarily been as quick to come through as what we've seen over here in the UK and in Europe. So we ourselves, as I understand, are still pondering whether to apply for that aid or collect that aid or not. I think it's available, but when you step in to take the aid, then you've also got to look at bringing potentially you know, a lot of the workers back, and which you may not have the ability to be able to apply some time, especially when you're talking about hangar activity, etc. So there's still a question mark, and while it's there and it's available, it hasn't necessarily been as quick. So there's some reason that it's not necessarily been as quick to come through at this moment in time, but there's also a question mark in terms of, do you actually want to take it? If you've got the liquidity and you potentially see a rebound and can survive the crisis throughout, it may well work out beneficial to actually not take the state loan, as you obviously look to continue to diversify and restructure, realign, site rationalization, as we've been calling it, so to speak, in terms of ensuring that we have a platform to build moving forward. So difficult, what I want to obviously is expand in that side of things, because I'm not necessarily, I guess, permissible to the echelons of AAR in terms of some of the ins and outs, but obviously from a hearsay perspective, that's probably the feedback I can give you.
Hearsay is good. Hearsay is good. Paul Briggs.
Well, I get back to my basic concept is that the businesses that should be getting government support are the winning businesses who have been savaged by COVID-19 for reasons totally outside of their control. So an example of the way this should not work is Alitalia. Alitalia should have been allowed to fail. Michael O'Leary is absolutely right that this is a total aberration of free market. So what? And the other issue is that, I mean, to some extent, maybe the Lufthansa shareholder is right. If they take massive government loans and then they're not allowed to restructure their workforce and to negotiate properly with other state-owned businesses running airports, again, they're not going to be able to become efficient. So, I mean, just finally, I'll just say that for the UK, if it's too late for us to rejoin the European Union this year, you know, at least we should be following all of these European regulations. The European state aid rules are exactly what we need at the moment. The suspension of those rules should be limited, and the UK should focus on adapting the same rules and ideally staying in EASA.
Yeah, definitely the latter. A couple of quick fire questions, if I might. How do you see the pursuit of decarbonisation going? Do you think it's going to just slip down the agenda and be politely ignored, or do you see OEMs and others recognising that maybe they've got some spare capacity and they will accelerate their attempts to increase the decarbonisation of their products? Do you see a passenger reaction of expecting it? How does that look? But very quickly, please. So, Katherine, how does it look for you?
Well, if we remember just before the COVID thing, we were all talking about Greta Thunberg, and she came to Bristol and the whole of the city was overrun. And that issue has not gone away from any respect. And what we endeavour to say in our sector is we're very, very focused on it. And in actual fact, some of the state aid measures that you talked about, Brian, have come with strings attached. So, for example, the French one, the French package and the German package, there's a lot of money going into hydrogen investment. And absolutely, this is something our CEO is very passionate about. Sustainable aviation, more innovation, reducing the use of fuel in terms of gas, you know, aeroplane gasoline. So we've got to make sure that that's reduced, and you know, newer aircraft. Obviously, I would say that, and also our engineers across Europe and across the world. You know, they focus their time on developing more sustainable aircraft, and particularly the wings, the aerodynamics, which we specialise in here. Of course, the engine, working closely with Rolls-Royce and Safran is absolutely key. Sustainable aviation fuel is another big project that a lot of money is going into, and of course, as you know, the UK industry signed up to various commitments on that. So I don't think it's certainly not been put on the back burner. It's absolutely right there in the forefront, and something that, you know, we absolutely see as something that needs to be focused on. Of course, with COP26 coming up here in the UK next year, there's lots and lots of focus and lots of opportunities to focus people's minds.
Paul Richardson, any points from you?
Well, you know, obviously being in lockdown, you are pretty sensitive to the news on a daily basis, and I think the collective, to Katherine's point, the collective consciousness globally has seemingly gathered pace during the crisis. So, especially when you see the government bailouts, obviously Lufthansa, I think that was, I guess, on the back of certain green initiatives that need to come through, etc., as well as the French, as Katherine mentioned. I think there's a government talking about, or the Labour side at least, talking about the bailout for Virgin that would then potentially be in line with certain green initiatives. So, you know, for us as well, it's certainly on the agenda. I don't think it's going away. I think it's gathered pace for sure. So for us, we will definitely be looking at that side. And to Paul's point as well, when you talk about from a, you know, a future perspective, the green initiative is going to be obviously a key factor here, as will, as Paul mentioned, the digital footprint, and that's something that we will definitely continue to look at as we, you know, eke out process automation, etc., and streamline those supply chains. And with the digital point as well, there's potentially an environmental impact, but also, you know, it doesn't necessarily. I think people get, I guess, carried away with the thought that digital will, you know, cost thousands and thousands when you can actually make significant gains with a very small investment. So we will be looking at those.
And to Paul Briggs, father of two daughters who refuse to fly, what's your view?
Oh yes, I was thinking of mentioning that. For the first time ever this year, you know, I asked two of my daughters where they wanted to fly on holiday, and they just said to me, "We don't want to fly anywhere, Daddy." So, you know, I think that this is not going to go away with the younger generation, even if the older generation become quite focused on survival and profitability for a period. So I strongly, strongly hope that the entire ESG agenda continues through this crisis. And of course, great advances are being made by the OEMs, the airframers and the engine OEMs, also air traffic controllers and fuel. But I think that, you know, Sir Brian, as you said when you introduced the Sustainable Aviation UK talk, I regarded those as really sort of extremes on the continuum. A view expressed by The Guardian that in order to deal with the environmental catastrophe, you need to shut all of the airports. Now, I believe in an open international Britain, so I strongly oppose that. But I think it may be necessary if the industry wants to be able to get investors, to recruit quality young people, and to have happy retail customers. People may have to reconsider the 70% growth.
Yeah, thank you. And that neatly segues into the last question, which is just a one-line response. So a young person, fresh out of school, contemplating going to university or contemplating getting an apprenticeship maybe, and says to you, should I go into aviation and aerospace, or is it a busted flush? What would you say to them? What would you say, Katherine?
Well, just a couple of days ago, it was International Women in Engineering Day, and I do my best to encourage women to go into engineering, but I encourage every young person to consider a career in engineering. And just one other quote I really love is one that I understand is over the former GPO building in Dollis Hill, London. Research is the door to tomorrow. So let's ensure that the young people in the UK realise that by going into engineering, you can help some of these problems of tomorrow.
Amen to that. What about you, Paul Richardson?
100%. I mean, the diversity of this industry is enormous, and anyone coming in as a youngster coming into this industry will benefit from, obviously, from the engineering side of things, the technical side of things, but not only that, have potential exposure to the finance side of things. So the gambit is broad, and now those skills can ultimately be taken away and taken elsewhere if required in the future. So 100%.
Paul Briggs, nascent lawyers, coming to you.
I'd say I've had 33 years of unreasonable fun and excitement in the industry. And I finish with, again, repeat the words of Mark Twain: travel's fatal to bigotry and narrow-mindedness. I've lost you.
A really interesting session. Thank you for that. And amen to fun and excitement. In terms of how this looks, and it's quite often the case that those of us who are very close to the where the rubber meets the road maybe have a different view. But you know, for people standing back, there are perhaps three things I want to make sure people understand. First of all, aerospace and aviation as an ecosystem will return, no doubt. It may be in a different form, slightly different business models. Of course, it depends on public confidence. But ultimately, as Paul has emphasized twice, we live in a globalized world, and decoupling globalization is not straightforward. So it will return. It'll take time. There'll be bumps in the road, but it will get there. Secondly, and if you like, the evidence and confidence for that is something that Katherine mentioned, which maybe doesn't seem relevant, but it's the ventilator challenge, because there is a classic example of how the aerospace industry and the electronics industry came together, showed just how innovative they could be. And most particularly, it just served the cause and accelerated the understanding of advanced manufacturing. It showed what could be done. And interestingly, it wasn't all done by greybeards at all. There was a lot of young people in there in the hackathon making it all work at the beginning. And the third point is that all of us realize that however we rebuild this sector, whatever our part is, then we do have to really understand the need for resilience. That's a very, very unpopular sort of notion in modern government, but actually without resilience, you can get sunk very quickly. So it just remains for me to thank the panel. Thank you very much for your time. Really interesting discussion. And thank you very much to our attendees, and I hope you've got a lot out of it. We will be publishing this on our website in due course. And our next webinar in this Corporate Partners series is the 8th of July. It's called Tempest, a Catalyst for Transformation. It's given by Michael Christie, who's Director of Future Combat Air Systems at BA Systems. Interesting for us because we haven't had to focus much on defense in the last 3 to 4 months. Focus has been obviously on commercial aerospace and aviation. And we're starting to look at the longer term implications for defense. And in late July, we'll be doing a corporate partner briefing on climate change and aviation, just to follow on from the one we did earlier, but specifically looking at how airlines are now responding and where that sits in their future strategy. And then we'll be rolling out our subsequent ones very shortly, because we've got a queue from ones we didn't run early on. So keep an eye, please, on the event calendar on the Society website. You can also find there a number of recordings, virtual webinars. You can use the National Aerospace Library for archive movies of the early days of aviation. And of course, always watch our events calendar. So thank you to our participants, thank you to our panelists, and have a great evening in this wonderful weather.